If you enjoy Strange Podcast and would like to show your support, please consider making a donation. Donations will help to develop Strange Podcast and ensure more episodes in the future. All donations go towards the production and distribution fees associated with producing our episodes. These fees include things like web hosting, audio hosting, website plugins and software, and studio hardware. You can make a donation of any size by visiting the donation page at strangepodcast.com. All donations are very gratefully received, no matter how big or small. Thank you for your support. Welcome to Strange. Revealing strange stories of the paranormal, bizarre coincidence, and unexplained phenomena. You can find out more about Strange Podcast and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter by visiting strangepodcast.com. Hello, I'm Chris Batchelor. Thank you for listening. This is episode 8, our Halloween special, and this time we'll be looking at some disturbing and spine-tingling ghost stories that are all apparently true. Firstly, though, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everybody who's taken the time to find us on Facebook, Twitter, and at strangepodcast.com. We've had some great feedback and some constructive suggestions too. We love getting your messages, so please keep them coming. Also, a quick apology. My intention when starting this podcast was to release a new episode on the 1st of every month. However, on the 1st of October, no episode. Well, all I can say is life got in the way. In the last few weeks, I've got married, had a honeymoon, and ran out of time to produce the podcast. I'm going to try and keep them as regular as possible, so thank you for your patience. Get in contact with Strange Podcast, and it could be you featured in a future episode. We're looking for interesting stories and accounts of strange happenings from our listeners. Maybe you've witnessed an apparition, been involved in an inexplicable event, or have a story to tell that can't be explained away by just coincidence. If you'd like to contribute to a future episode, please head to the contact page at strangepodcast.com. To be saddled with the nickname the Crippled Gay Ghost can't be very pleasant. But that is what happened to a woman in the 19th century, living in the Cripplegate area of London. She was the wife of a very well-to-do man, and one day she apparently died. Not to put too fine a point upon it, in those days before refrigeration, the deceased were buried with some haste. The grieving husband laid his wife to rest in the Church of St. Giles, Cripplegate. She wore her wedding dress, and her wedding ring didn't go unnoticed by the church's sexton, who was a caretaker of the time. The night the woman was laid to rest in her tomb, the sexton broke in. The apparent thief attempted to remove the ring from the woman's finger, but it would not budge. So he then used a knife and tried to cut off her finger. Not only did the finger start to bleed, but the apparent corpse suddenly sat up in the coffin, giving a blood-curdling scream. Not surprisingly, the thief was so shocked, he fled the church, leaving his lantern behind, never to return. The woman somehow managed to stagger home, where she pounded on the front door. Her servant answered, and saw her mistress standing there, pale and exhausted. The servant herself screamed and slammed the door on the woman, thinking she was a ghost. Fortunately, her husband was at home and heard the commotion. When he saw his wife, he instantly realised she was not a spectre and let her into the house, where she eventually made a full recovery. She lived for many years, and she and her husband had another 4 children. However, she was forever known by people in the area as the Crippled Gay Ghost. On the 22nd of June 1893, Admiral Sir George Tryin was on manoeuvres with the Mediterranean fleet off the coast of Syria. Suddenly, he gave orders for his ship, the Victoria, and the nearby Camperdown to turn inwards and steam towards each other. It was obvious to all on board that disaster was imminent, but none of his subordinates dared overrule or question Tryon's extraordinary command. In consequence, the 2 ships collided, and the Victoria sank, taking the Admiral and 400 mariners to a watery grave. As the ship went down, Sir George was heard to say, "It's entirely my fault." At more or less the exact moment Sir George was plummeting towards the ocean bed, his wife was holding a party in their house in Eaton Place, London. Suddenly Sir George, resplendent in full naval regalia, appeared before over 100 guests, strolling across the room, and vanished. Lady Tryin didn't see him herself, and was mystified when told by her guests that her husband had just walked through the room. She explained to her guests that he was far away at sea. Sadly, the next day, word reached her of the tragedy, and she realised that her guests must have seen her husband's ghost. The Barini Haunting, New England, United States. One of the most shocking poltergeist cases of recent times. A family was disturbed and terrified by a series of apparitions. The poltergeist activity took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s and became known as the Barini Haunting. What began as a benign but remarkable haunting escalated into terrifying poltergeist activity, which makes this one of the most remarkable cases of paranormal activity in recent American history. The real name of the family involved has been kept a secret to protect their privacy. The hauntings started shortly after Joe Barini moved his wife Rose and 2 of her children from a former marriage into his ancestral New England home in the late 1970s. The first ghost was that of a little girl whose voice was heard one evening in May 1979. The girl's apparition spoke to his wife, Rose. "Mama, Mama, this is Serena." Neither Joe nor Rose knew of any girl in the family's past by the name of Serena at that time. After Serena's first visit, their daughter Daisy went to the doctors to have her tonsils taken out. During the operation, there were complications, which resulted in her heart stopping, and she nearly passed away. The timing of Serena's visit and Daisy's near-death experience did not go unnoticed by the Barinis. Serena's visit to the family also coincided with the stroke of Joe's grandmother and a night in November before the elderly woman passed away. Her connection to the family seems strong, as Joe remembers waking up, hearing Serena's voice, to find his wife choking next to him in her sleep. After shaking her awake, she shares with him that her ex-husband was choking her in her dream. From Christmas 1979 to February 1981, the paranormal activity in the house had decreased. And then in March, Rose was startled by the ghost of a small boy, dressed completely in white, walking along the upstairs landing. It was almost like looking through a milk bottle, Rose later told researchers. It was very peaceful. It stayed for about 2 hours on and off, coming and going. The boy's spirit appeared again a week and a half later, and this time spoke to Rose, asking, "Where do all the lonely people go? Where do I belong?" The boy's ghost was witnessed by Joe. He watched the apparition enter each bedroom, then settled on the floor of the hallway in search of something. Curious, Joe later pulled up the floorboards and found a medallion of the Virgin Mary. On one occasion, when Joe saw the boy's apparition, he heard the little boy say to him, "My oldest brother is the only one who can help me." Joe did not know what this meant, but that very sentence was the beginning of terror. It was shortly after this statement that objects began to move in an unpredictable fashion, with phones flying, doors slamming, and objects being yanked from Rose's hand. The Barinis, upset, sought the advice of a local priest who said they should ignore the spirit if it should appear again. The next time the boy in white appeared to Rose, she did as she was advised and paid no attention. Immediately, the closet door began to slam, opening and shutting repeatedly. On some occasions, unexplained footsteps were heard in the house, and a box of macaroni was yanked from Rose's hand and thrown to the floor. Joe and Rose returned to the church for help. Two of the priests agreed to visit the house. The priests came and they blessed the house and said mass. Initially, there was a quiet spell after the rituals, but it did not last long. In June 1981, a new entity descended upon their home. This one, according to the family, was straight from hell. The apparition of a sinister, hunchbacked male figure clad in a black cape. Throughout the summer, the hunchback, which the Barinis described as having large feet and a gruff voice, appeared regularly in the house. The Barinis tried to question the entity, but the only thing it told them was, "I'm a minister of God." Though it proclaimed itself a minister of God, it brought with him only fury and intimidation. Rose took the brunt of the figure's attacks. On one occasion, Rose was struck by an open freezer door. One day when Rose was praying with her rosary, the dark figure tried to distract her with various obscenities. The poltergeist activity increased in frequency and intensity. Joe, Rose and 15-year-old John reported that they had been struck by thrown objects. The bedroom telephone continued to fly off the table. A bedside lamp fell, striking Rose on the head. Furniture in several rooms was on occasion found overturned or moved. Daisy's bedroom desk was somehow transported downstairs. The retractable attic stairs were opened and shut repeatedly, and with such violence that it cracked the hall ceiling. Several religious objects were removed from walls or broken. During an evening meal, Rose's arm was twisted behind her back, and her head pulled to one side with such force that she began to choke. On more than one occasion, Joe testified that he saw Rose pulled out of bed at night, levitated into the air, and then dropped to the floor. After one of these attacks, bruises were found on her arms and legs, as if from a powerful grip. 2 months after it first appeared, the dark hunchbacked entity became its most violent. Not long after Joe left the house to work the night shift at his factory job, a loud banging shook the bedroom walls. The bed was rising off the floor. Rose said, "I tried to scream and the door slammed, so I could not get out of the room. The dog was growling and the door opened. Rose struggled to get to the children's bedrooms, but their doors slammed shut, and she was dragged by unseen forces back into her room. Invisible hands began to choke her and scratch her. She managed to phone Joe. He rushed home and ran upstairs to the bedroom, where he saw the bed jumping as high as 2 feet into the air, and found Rose crouching in a corner clutching a crucifix." Remarkably, the Barinis still refused to abandon their home. Their minds were changed, however, when one morning they awoke to find a heavy carving knife stabbed into the kitchen table. Fearing that their lives could truly be in danger, the Barinis moved out of the house for a month, putting most of their belongings into storage. Once again, they sought the help from a priest, who went into the house and performed an exorcism. When the Barinis returned to their home, the evil seemed to have vanished. They no longer saw apparitions of any kind, or suffered any more poltergeist activity. Ironically, it was only after the haunting activity stopped that Joe Barini invited an investigation by the Psychical Research Foundation, based in Durham, North Carolina. The organization is now the American Institute of Parapsychology, based at Gainesville, Florida. The investigators were able to collaborate some of the Barinis' claims through friends, neighbors, and their priest, all of whom testified that they witnessed poltergeist activity in the Barinis' home. If you'd like to make a comment on what you've heard in this episode, you can on the episode page at strangepodcast.com. There you'll also find interesting links to the resources and evidence featured in this episode. And don't forget, you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter by going to strangepodcast.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.